Hello, welcome to the online portion of our class. So I am recording this actually after the class we had on Tuesday, and this is for the first week of October when I will be in Texas. So this week our content is going to be online. I'm going to have a few of these lectures. Maybe the background will be different in some of them. I don't know. Maybe they'll all be recorded from my office here at Finlandia. Some might be recorded at home. This week, you're supposed to be working on your take-home exam, which by now should be in Canvas by the time you're watching this. And our course is going to be kind of moving forward. So we had the first portion of our course, we dealt with ancient philosophy, and we read Plato and Aristotle. And these were philosophers who were writing in ancient Greece in the 3rd and 4th centuries BC. We're going to be taking a rather large jump of about 13 to 1400 years into the Middle Ages. So it's not that philosophy wasn't written during the interim period. There was Roman philosophy and there was early medieval philosophy, but we're going to jump into kind of the philosophy of the High Middle Ages. Now, the world was different then. So we are moving from a pagan world to a Christian world. So sometimes the Middle Ages are called the Age of Faith, and it was a time when people were primarily occupied with religious questions. So the two philosophers that we're going to take a look at who are representative of the Middle Ages, both of them are saints in the Catholic Church. One is Saint Anselm of Canterbury, and the other is Saint Thomas Aquinas. The first one that we're going to look at is St. Anselm of Canterbury. He became the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1093. Now, we normally think of Canterbury of course, it's in England. Currently, it's it's the place where the head of the English Church, or the religious head of the Anglican Church, resides. Of course, the king is the head of the Anglican Church, but the person who's really in charge of the church is the Archbishop of Canterbury. I think that's Justin Welby today. At one point it was St. Anselm who we're going to be reading. Now, Anselm wasn't English. He was not born in England. He was actually born in what is now Italy, and a portion of Italy that at that time was part of the Kingdom of Lombardy. So the map of Europe looked different then than it does today. So he was part of this part of Italy. When he was a young man, he entered the Benedictine order, which at that time, well, it was actually still pretty old at that time, but that was the order of monks, and they had monasteries throughout Europe. And he went to the Abbey of Bec, or the Monastery of Bec, which is in Normandy, and so that's currently part of France. So you probably remember from World War II, on D-Day, the United States and the Allies had the invasion of Normandy. That was where they made their beachhead against the Nazis. So Normandy refers to that region of France, and it was really important at this time. And if you are thoughtful or well-studied, you might know that in the year 1066, William of Normandy conquered England. And it's what's called the Norman invasion, and it was permanent. The Normans conquered England, and gradually they became one people. So in that early 11th century, most of the archbishops of Canterbury, which was the leading prelate of the church in England even at that time, they came from Normandy. And that's exactly where St. Anselm came from in the year 1093. So not very long after the invasion of England by William the Conqueror, he was the Archbishop of Canterbury. Most of his academic work, or his philosophical or theological work, was done when he was the abbot of Bec. Likely he never spoke English. He surely spoke Norman French, but even if he did speak English at the time that he lived, it would not be the English that you and I speak. So the English that you and I speak developed as a mixture of the prior English, which was called Old English or Anglo-Saxon, and the Norman French. It's a mixture of those two languages. So those two languages first came together, and our example of Middle English would be somebody like Geoffrey Chaucer, right? And if we read Chaucer, most of the time we have to read it in translation. And if we're not reading it in translation, we have to read it with extensive notes because the language is very different then. And then from Chaucer, it even developed further to modern English. And then by the time we get to like Shakespeare and Ben Jonson and those guys, we have modern English. But even then, a lot of us find it challenging to read something like Shakespeare, which is only 400 years old, because the language has developed, of course, from that point. In any case, St. Anselm didn't write in English. He wrote in Latin. And the reason he wrote in Latin was because that was the language of the church at the time. We are going to be reading his argument for the existence of God. And then we're also going to be reading later on in the week some arguments for the existence of God by St. Thomas Aquinas. These men did not agree with one another as to what constituted a good argument for the existence of God. Anselm's argument is really rather short. We'll see that St. Thomas Aquinas' arguments are really rather short too. We're going to read 5 of those. Anselm's argument is short, and it's kind of difficult because it feels like to a lot of people when they read it, he's kind of pulling a fast one on us, that he's trying to sneak a conclusion in that doesn't have the support of his premises. And that's not really what he's doing. So if you read his argument and you think, he's got to be leaving something out here, that's probably a very normal reaction to have to what Anselm has written. You need to work through that. And then once you work through that, then we can start to really engage what he's talking about. Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll look at the text, which I said is not very long. And we'll get a sense of where he's at. So this starts on page 345 of your textbook, right? And the first thing he talks about here, that the heading of the text is the mind stirred up to the contemplation of God. This is a very kind of medieval type of a thing to do. So last week we talked about what do people value, right? What do people have as their supreme good? Clearly in the Middle Ages, one of the things that more of the people had as their supreme good than they do today was the contemplation of God or the pursuit of holiness. St. Anselm was a monk, right? He had given up living an earthly life to go live in a monastery and serve God. So this is something that he's really into. So even if it's foreign to our experience, we want to try to kind of get into his mind so that we can understand what he's talking about and learn from him. So he begins. Come now, wretched man, escape for a moment from your preoccupations and draw back a little while from your seething thoughts. Lay aside now your burdensome worries and put off all your wearisome tasks. Empty yourself to God for a little while and rest a short time in him. Enter the private chamber of your mind. Shut out everything except God and whatever may help you to search for him. Lock the door and seek him out. Speak now, my whole heart, and say to God, I seek thy face, Lord, will I seek. So we have some mysticism, right? And this is typical of how the medieval philosophers would write, nearly all of them. The church was not only the dominant institution of society, but it was the organizing institution of society. Everybody was a member of the same church. All of the people, all of the clerical class, obviously, all of the rulers. Now, there were some minorities in Europe at this time. There were some Muslims, not very many. There were some Jews, not very many. But for the most part, everybody had the same religion. One thing that we want to be aware of is that in Western Europe at this time, and we're talking about Western Europe, Normandy is in Western Europe, and so was England. In Western Europe at this time, there weren't any Protestants. Everybody was of the Roman Catholic religion. The Reformation was several hundred years away from happening, so there was a general agreement. That being said, the general agreement on religious principles didn't dissuade people from using their intellect to engage religious truth. So, but he starts in this prayerful way. And the editor of your book, even though he's not giving us too much of anything, really, I mean, the excerpts are really short, the editor of your book wants to give you a flavor for that, even though he's not giving you a whole lot of anything. So this is typical of how medieval philosophy starts. So we're not really going to see this as much in St. Thomas Aquinas when we get there, because the excerpts don't have it. But rest assured that is there. I mean, one of the things that St. Thomas Aquinas did was he wrote some of the prayers and hymns that are still used by the Roman Catholic Church today. That's part of what he did. Let's turn now to page 346 to the section that's titled God Truly Exists. Right? And first he's going to start by praising God, and then he's going to proceed with a quotation from Scripture. This is cultural. This is not getting into his argument yet. His argument will be later, right? He says, "So Lord, you who give understanding to those who have faith, grant me to understand so far as you judge it fit, that you indeed exist as we believe, and that you are what we believe you to be." Right? So this is how these philosophers started. They started from the premise of faith, and the medieval mind understood the practice of philosophy and theology in particular, as faith-seeking understanding. Right? So he's going to start with a confession of faith, and then he's going to try to understand that faith. And then he goes on, he says, "Now we believe that you are something than which nothing greater can be thought." This is his first philosophical proposition. Right? Now we believe that you are something than which nothing greater can be thought. That is a definition of God. God is that which nothing greater can be thought. And that's going to be one of the philosophical premises that he's going to bring to his proof for the existence of God. God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. And he continues, "Is there then no such being, since the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God?" Right? So the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. That's a quotation from scriptures, from one of the Psalms. It depends upon your psalm numbering. There's two schemes for numbering the Psalms. One is the numbering system from what's called the Septuagint. This is a Bible, or it's not really a Bible yet. The Septuagint was a version of the Old Testament that existed at the time of Christ, and it was in Greek. It was not in Hebrew. So what had happened was that an Egyptian, because that's where the best library was, and the Egyptians all spoke Greek. Not all of them, but the ruling class of Egypt spoke Greek because of Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great was in the 3rd century BC, and that lasted for a long time. This Greek influence in Egypt lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years. So 70 Hebrew scholars, were called together to translate the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. And that's where we get this name Septuagint, because it means the 70. So 70 scholars were called forward to translate it into Greek, and this became really the authoritative version of Scripture. Later on, the New Testament, right? So the 4 Gospels and then the epistles written by the apostles and Revelation. The New Testament would be written in its original form in Greek, right? So a lot of it was written by St. Paul, who went on the missionary versions to those places where they spoke Greek. So first he went to Antioch, but then he went to like Ephesus and Corinth and Thessalonica, and he made his way all the way to Rome. But St. Paul's letters were originally written in Greek because they were written to Greek-speaking people, and then the Gospels themselves, a lot of them were written in Greek. So it's thought Matthew may have been written in Hebrew first, or Aramaic, and then translated into Greek. But the text that we received was in Greek. But then, of course, Luke was written by a Gentile, and it was written in Greek. Mark was originally written in Greek. Mark was one of the companions of Christ, but he traveled with St. Peter. That was written in Greek because St. Peter went on those missionary journeys as well. He went to Antioch, and then he ended up, of course, in Rome. And John was also written in Greek. So John lived in Jerusalem for some time, but then made his way to not what's modern Greece, but to the western shore of what is now Turkey, and he lived in the city of Ephesus there. He was exiled for a while to a Greek island called Patmos, and that's where he wrote Revelation. We don't know where he wrote. We don't know where he wrote the Gospel, but we do know that it was written in Greek and was largely for a Greek audience. So it's not surprising then that the church had accepted this Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, and this was the version that they had during the Middle Ages, right? And so this quotation, "The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God," is from Psalm 13, if you look at the Septuagint version. Now, in the Middle Ages, the Jews reformed their scripture, and they came out with a new Hebrew text of the Old Testament. It was called the Masoretic text, and a lot after the Protestant Reformation, a lot of the new Protestants didn't want to go with the texts that the church had been using for a long time. They instead prepared new editions of the Bible based on this Masoretic text. And so according to those most Protestant Bibles then, this comes from Psalm 14, verse 1, because they had a different numbering on the Psalms. So that was a long aside, but probably, I think, something worth knowing. Even if you're not a religious person, you're going to be encountering times when you will need to know something about the Bible. And then there are a lot of religious people even who don't really have much of an idea historically where the Bible came from and what were the original languages of the Bible. So hopefully it was worth it. Back to our text. So the fool has said in his heart there is no God. And then Anselm continues, "Yet surely the same fool, when he hears the very words I now speak, something than which nothing greater can be thought, understands what he hears." Right? So he is making his philosophical argument here. This is a foundational premise of his argument, that God is something than which nothing greater can be thought. Even the fool understands this, that God is something than which nothing greater can be thought. And this is what he's trying to establish here first. Right? And this is why he says that the fool understands what he hears, and what he understands exists in his understanding, even if he does not understand that it actually exists. Now we're getting into the meat of the argument here. So what Anselm is saying is that God is something than which nothing greater can be thought. And everybody can understand this. Even the one who doesn't believe in God can understand that God is something greater than which can be thought. Sorry, God is that which nothing greater can be thought, right? And so for that person, for the unbeliever, right, this idea, something than which nothing greater can be thought, exists in his understanding, even if he does not understand that it actually exists. So we're talking about two levels here: existence itself, existence in reality, and existence in the understanding. Okay, so Anselm is saying that for the unbeliever who does not believe that God exists in reality, still believes that God exists in the understanding, that we can understand this concept of God, we can have an understanding of that than which nothing greater can be thought or nothing greater can be conceived. Right? Let's continue. For it is one thing for an object to exist in the understanding, and another to understand that the object exists. When an artist thinks in advance of what he is about to paint, he has it in his understanding, but he does not yet understand it to exist, since he has not yet painted it. Right? This is an easy concept. If you're going to sit down to paint, you'll have an idea about what you want to paint in your mind. It will exist in your mind, and the job of the artist is the one who takes the vision of what exists in his mind and puts it onto the canvas or onto the paper or sculpts it into the stone or forms it into the clay or whatever medium he's working with, right? We understand that the art is a translation of what is in the mind so that it then exists in reality, right? I know this sounds really, really simple, but it's actually important to do this work of explaining these basic concepts, because pretty soon he's gonna he's gonna draw his conclusion, and if we're not careful, we're gonna miss how he does it, because it's gonna happen so quickly. Okay, so when he has painted it, then he both has it in his understanding and understands that it exists, since he has painted it. Right? And it seems like he's kind of beating a dead horse here, right? Because he's repeating himself. But we have an artist who has an idea of what he's going to paint in his mind. It exists in his understanding, but it doesn't exist in the world. And then he paints it, and then it exists in the world. And it exists then in both places. It exists in his understanding, and it exists in reality. Right? Not a difficult concept. Hence, even the fool must agree that there exists in the understanding at least something than which nothing greater can be thought. For when he hears this expression, he understands it, and whatever is understood exists in the understanding. Right? So what is he saying? Well, this expression, that than which nothing greater can be thought, is an intelligible concept. And anybody with, even the fool, anybody with any form of intelligence, any rational creature, can grasp this. He can grasp this thought that there can exist in his understanding this concept of that than which nothing greater can be thought. Right? And then the argument is going to turn. So it's going to go from very self-evident and obvious expressions to something that we're going to ask questions about. He says, yet surely that than which a greater cannot be thought cannot exist in the understanding alone. And we might be saying, what? Of course it can. Let's go back to the painter, right? The painter who had the understanding of what he was going to paint, right? In his understanding. What he was going to paint was in his understanding, but not in the world. Right? It could have happened that maybe he didn't have a canvas, or maybe he didn't have the right paints, or maybe he decided to go to a baseball game, or maybe he thought about what was in his understanding, he didn't like it, and he decided to paint something else. it's very easy for us to say to think about this, right? That there exists all kinds of things in the understanding that don't also exist in the world, because the example that we just had was one of those, right? We had something that existed in the understanding and not in the world. But he says, surely that which in greater cannot be thought, right? So surely this concept of God cannot exist in the understanding alone. That's a really big claim, because he just showed us how something else could. Right? He says, for once granted that it exists, if it is only in the understanding, it can be thought of as existing in reality, and this is greater. So what is he saying here? So we have this concept in our understanding of something than which nothing greater can be thought. This is intelligible, right? This is an intelligible thought, something than which nothing greater can be thought. Okay? And now he's going to compare this, the existence of this in the understanding and the existence of this in reality. Right? So he's got something that exists in the understanding, and we're uncertain if it exists in reality. But we're going to say, let's suppose that it does. For the sake of argument, let's suppose that it does. What would we know about that? Well, he says the first thing that we would know is that it would be greater than that which exists in the understanding alone. Right? So if it exists both in the understanding and in the real world, then it's greater than just in the understanding alone. And we say, okay, that makes sense, right? That's not too radical of a claim. Something that exists both in the understanding and in the real world is greater than something that exists in the understanding alone. That's all he's saying so far, right? So let's get that. Then he continues, hence, if that than which a greater cannot be thought exists solely in the understanding, it would follow that the very thing which a greater cannot be thought turns out to be that very thing which a greater, turns out which greater thing that cannot be thought than that which a greater can be thought. Sorry, let me read that again, because that is the sentence on which his whole argument turns, right? He says, hence, if that than which a greater cannot be thought exists solely in the understanding, it would follow that the very thing than which a greater cannot be thought turns out to be that than which a greater can be thought. This is what his argument turns on, right? And then he says, but this is clearly impossible. So we have two possibilities. Okay? That than which nothing greater can be thought exists in the understanding alone, or that than which nothing greater can be thought exists in the understanding and in reality. Okay? Those are our two possibilities. If we look at the first one, that it exists in the understanding alone, it's problematic. And here's why. Because if I have in my understanding that than which nothing greater can be conceived, and it doesn't exist in reality, then I can conceive of something that's greater than that, and that's something which does exist in reality. Okay? So if it exists in my understanding alone, right, that which nothing greater can be conceived, if it exists in my understanding alone and not in reality, then I can conceive of something greater, and that's something that exists in understanding and reality. right? So what would happen is that if it doesn't exist in the understanding and in reality, if it only exists in reality, then it entails a contradiction, right? Because you both can have it in your understanding and you can't have it in your understanding. Let's see what he says. He says, this turns out to be clearly impossible. Hence, something than which a greater can be thought undoubtedly exists both in the understanding and in reality. He doesn't really clarify, does he? And the way to do this, and if we were in class, I would draw this out on the board, right? We've only got two possibilities, right? We know that it exists in the understanding because even the fool knows that, right? It's an intelligible thing to say. When somebody says, I have a concept of something than which nothing greater can be thought, we're not confused about what they're saying. That's a concept that makes sense. And because it's a concept that makes sense, we know that it's in the understanding. That's not in doubt. The other thing that's not in doubt is that existence in the understanding and existence in the real world aren't the same, right? So to have only a concept of something greater than only a concept of something, then nothing greater can be thought. And then in the real world, something greater than nothing can be thought. That the one in the real world would actually be greater than the one in the understanding alone. That's not in doubt either, right? If both are true, right? If both are true, then the concept that we have in the understanding of that than which nothing greater can be thought, and the reality that there is something in reality that is something than which nothing greater can be thought, those concepts match up, right? We're thinking of the existing thing, and there's nothing problematic about that. If, on the other hand, those concepts don't match up, right? That there's something in the understanding alone and not also out in the world. It's understanding alone and not also out in the world, then we have a disconnect. Because I have the concept in my mind, and if it doesn't exist in the world, then that concept wants to come into my mind, the greater thing, because the greater thing is something than which nothing greater can be thought. And it's really hard to hold on to that. Because the thought, the understanding, the existence in the understanding is problematic only if it doesn't correspond to something real, right? If it doesn't correspond to something real, we can't hold on to that. If it does, it's not problematic. And this is his proof for the existence of God, that this particular concept in the mind has to map onto reality. Because if it doesn't, it can't be in the mind, but we know that it's in the mind because when we say the words, it's intelligible. We can make sense of it, right? So let's proceed through the text a little bit farther. It says, the next heading, God cannot be thought not to exist. Boy, that's a lot of negative terms, right? God cannot be thought not to exist, which is the same thing as to say God must be thought of as existing. Right? And he says, and certainly this entity so truly exists that it cannot be thought not to exist. For it is possible to think of a being which cannot be thought of as not existing. And this is greater than something which can be thought of as not existing. Right? So if that then which is a greater cannot be thought, can be thought not to exist, it would follow that the very same thing which a greater cannot be thought is not that than which a greater cannot be thought. And this is inconsistent. So what is he doing here? Well, he is taking the position that there is no God, right? There is no God, which means that you have something in the understanding and not in the world. We have this concept of that within which nothing greater can be thought. He's saying that the concept of the non-correspondence of the understanding to reality involves a contradiction, right? And so the logical process here is, if you have two possibilities, right? There's only two possibilities. If one of them leads to a contradiction, then the other one must be true, right? If non-belief in the reality of something than which nothing greater can be thought leads to a contradiction, then the reality of the real existence of that than which nothing greater can be thought must then be true. Let's read this again, because it's slippery. He says, so if that then which a greater cannot be thought can be thought not to exist, right? So this is the position of in the mind, not in the world, or in the understanding, not in the world. It would follow that the very same thing than which nothing, it would follow that the very same thing than which a greater cannot be thought is not that than which a greater cannot be thought. And this is inconsistent, right? Because if you have it in the mind and not in the world, then the thing in the mind isn't what it is, right? It both is the thing than which nothing greater can be thought and not the thing than which nothing greater can be thought at the same time, right? And so we have both a and not a, and that's a contradiction, right? And that's why he concludes, hence something than which a greater cannot be thought exists so truly that it cannot be even thought to not exist. So he's saying that non-belief in God involves a logical contradiction. This is a very, very strong claim, that non-belief in God involves a logical contradiction. And then the next paragraph there, it's again, he's praising God. So he's gonna take that concept, something than which nothing greater can be thought, and then he's going to link that up to God. That's not controversial, but it gets us, to more of this flowery language that's typical of what we find in medieval philosophy. So then this being is you, O Lord our God, so truly do exist, O Lord my God, that you cannot even be thought to not exist. And he goes on from there. So this proof, right, which is called the ontological proof, it's proof from the nature of being itself, right? This proof doesn't sit well with a lot of people. One of the people that didn't sit well with, and Anselm had this correspondence, was this other monk, Gaunalon was his name. And if we had the whole text, we would have the reply and then the reply to the reply. And what Gaunalon said, who is called the fool, right, is he said, well, can we take this logic and apply it to something else? And so the counter argument that he gave was, I have in my understanding the concept of an island of which no greater island can be thought to exist. Do I have to therefore say that that island exists? That in point of fact, it would involve a contradiction, just like what Anselm is saying about God, that do we have to have the perfect island, the island of which nothing greater can be thought than any other, right? And Anselm replies to this, right? Anselm replies to this, and he says, well, there's something different about islands, right? And when he is saying this, I think what he really means is there's something different about God than there is about islands or any other type of an object. Because one of the things that happens when we talk about an island, right? So, and this goes back to Aristotle, right? So one of the things that we talk about when we talk about an island is that an island is going to have a formal cause, right? There's something that makes it an island, right? And that is that it's a piece of land surrounded by water. Right? Something makes it an island. And insofar as something is an island, it is or it is not, right? It is or it is not, which means that you can't have something that's more of an island or greater in virtue of its islandness than any other island. All islands are essentially the same because they share the same formal cause. And so it doesn't really make as much sense to say that I have in my mind the concept of an island of which no greater island can be conceived. Because we have a concept of island, and that concept kind of applies to all islands. Now, there are some islands that are kind of in the fuzzy area, right? Islands that, at low tide are not islands, but are at high tide are islands. But I think that we get the point, right? So we talked about some of this last week when we talked about the Nicomachean Ethics, right? We were talking about how all human beings are human beings, and no person, no human being is any more of a human being or less than a human being than any other. Only some of them are better and worse, right? They're better and worse in terms of their teleological cause or their final cause. But in terms of their formal cause, they're neither better nor worse. They just are. And this is where most of the counter arguments about going back to Anselm come to, is that he's talking about a formal cause when he talks about God. He's talking about that thing than which nothing greater can be conceived. So he's attributing greatness to the formological element, of God, and not to any other element. Right? And so this is where most of the objections turn out, right? So when you talk about great islands, it's like, well, islands exist. That's where you got the concept of an island from. This is clear from Aristotle, right? Because we know from sense perception and memory and understanding, right, that islands exist, and we don't have gradations of their islandness, right? Because when we talk about the great island, all of a sudden we stop talking about islands and we start talking about things like, birds and flowers and beaches and mountains, and these are different things, right? Whereas with the concept of God, we're talking about greatness of being itself. So this is Saint Anselm, and this is Anselm's ontological argument for the existence of God. It is a very old argument. It's been around for a long time, and it's really dependent upon logic. So we're gonna bracket that, and we're gonna talk about how this argument has been overcome. So the argument that Gounelon gave, the fool, is an argument that's been around for a long time. And it doesn't really work. And it doesn't work because implicit in that, the fool's argument is that you stop talking about the whatness and you start talking about the thisness. And Anselm has got them together in some way. And that applies uniquely to his case. Descartes famously reformulated this argument in terms of perfection, right? And he called perfection, he says that God has to exist because an existing creature, an existing perfect being, or the being of the highest perfection, would have more perfection than in thought. I think this version of the argument that Descartes gives, and we're going to study some Descartes later, but we're not going to get into this part of what he says. I think this one doesn't work as better. And Immanuel Kant, who we're also going to be studying later, he was an 18th century philosopher, comes along and he says that perfection is not an attribute, right? That anyway, we've been going on now for 45 minutes. I realize that our class is longer, but I think that when you're watching a video and it's less interactive, and I can't see you to respond to how you're getting things, I think about 45 minutes is probably a good length to talk about one thing. So for now, don't worry about Immanuel Kant's objections to the ontological argument. Make sure that you're getting it. Make sure that you see what he's setting up here is that we have a thing in the understanding and a thing in reality. And then there's a couple of possibilities, right? We're going to start off by saying that the thing is in the understanding, and that's an indubitable premise, that even the fool knows that. Even the fool can understand what we're talking about. There's the thing in the understanding. So that leaves only two possibilities. You have both a thing in the understanding and in the real world, or only the thing in the understanding and not in the real world. And we can test those out. If we have both of them true, that's not logically problematic. And if we have only one of them true, that is logically problematic, because the thing in the understanding all of a sudden is not that than which nothing greater can be thought, and it involves a contradiction. And since the possibility of not having the perfect thing, or the thing than which nothing greater can be thought, involves a contradiction, then it must be true. The 100% logical proof. In the next video, we're going to be talking about Thomas Aquinas.